In 2008, with the Lehman Brothers collapse, a global crisis began. This crisis affected the Eurozone in a very strong way. European countries reacted in different ways to the crisis, but almost all of them took some austerity measures in the first phase of the crisis. In fact, those were called ages of austerity. In parallel, some reforms have been implemented, in particular regarding the welfare and labor market. We also have to take into account the relevance of the implicit conditionality within the instruments deployed by the European Union in the enforcement of these measures. Today, we will focus on the cases of Italy, Spain, and France. Italy and Spain have two similar political economic models and almost identical welfare states. Moreover, they have structural similarities and labor market policy commonalities. However, these two countries took different paths during the crisis. While Spain moved towards a path of deregulation, Italy's trajectory of institutional change progressed towards an embedding flexibilization. But let's take a good look at Italy first.
The embedding flexibilization in Italy can be translated in a process of flexibilization of coordination while improving coverage, which starts from a low level. This process took different steps. The major ones took place during Berlusconi, Monti, and Renzi's governments. In 2011, the European Central Bank asked for reforms of labor market policy along with other structural reforms and spending cuts. A first weak response was given by Berlusconi's government, which was only able to reform collective bargaining through deregulation and subsequent decline in coordination. However, first significant measures were implemented during the technocratic government headed by Mario Monti and regarded the labor market. The core of the government's action was the so-called Fornero reform. This reform, on the one hand, extended coverage to more sectors, and on the other hand, it had a negative impact on coordination by deregulating dismissal protection of standards contracts combined with notable measures to improve coverage. Mainly, the Fornero reform covered pensions, dismissal, labor protection, temporary contracts, and, finally, unemployment protection. After a brief parenthesis of Letta's government, Renzi took the lead of the Italian executive. Renzi's government was under pressure of the European Union and other external institutions due to the continued high unemployment and slow growth. The most substantial reform bill, the so-called Jobs Act, just like the Fornero reform, combined a cut in coordination with an extension of coverage. More precisely, it regarded unemployment protection, public employment services, and dismissal. In conclusion, we can say that there has been a flexibilization in terms of coordination and an embedding in terms of coverage.
As stated before, Spain took a slightly different path that led the country to a deregulation of the labor market and welfare. Deregulation consists of dismantling of coordination capacities and a simultaneous decrease in coverage of existing institutions. We will focus on the reforms of the Zapatero and Rajoy's governments. In 2010, as a consequence of the worsening of unemployment and public deficit, the European Union pressed the Zapatero government to adopt structural measures. This resulted in the Real Decreto Ley that combined austerity measures with retrenchment in coordination dimension with an improvement on the coverage dimension. A second reform approved in 2011 brought to a negative shift on the coverage dimension. Under the European Council recommendations, the government applied a third reform aimed at reducing coordination in the Spanish system. In reaction to further pressures by the European institutions, the new government, headed by Mariano Rajoy, announced and put into practice labor market reforms that brought to a retrenchment of institutions of coordination and a drop in coverage of collective bargaining. After 2012, no significant reforms have been introduced because unemployment declined and employment increased with economic recovery. In conclusion, labor market reforms under austerity in Spain contributed to the strategic coordination of economic actors, especially by decentralizing collective bargaining and regulating dismissal protections of workers in standard unemployment. On the dimension of coverage, the implications are more mixed.
A comparison can be made with the French case, looking at the reforms applied during Sarkozy and Hollande's governments. Whereas the Italian government has severely restrained its budget over the course of the financial crisis, French President Nicolas Sarkozy has pushed stimulus measures, significantly increasing spending figures. In 2007, the new elected President Sarkozy announced a package of measures that aimed at introducing an unprecedented labor market flexibility, leading France to an economically more liberal path. However, at the beginning of the crisis, he had to change direction. In fact, with the Loi du Travail of 2008, the government moved towards more coverage and lower coordination. In 2012, the new president Hollande had to manage the worsening of unemployment and increasing public debt. In response to the pressures of the population, the European Union and other international actors, he proposed a new labour market and welfare reform whose outputs can be put under the name of bounded flexibility, in which marketization is contained within certain limits as defined by trade unions' ability to set the agenda of social partner negotiations.
The if game. Would reforms have been introduced or would they have been the same without the crisis and conditionality? We can propose two different scenarios. The first one entails the influence of globalization. Even without the crisis and pressure from the European Union, Italy, Spain and France would have anyway confronted themselves with a globalized and interconnected world requiring very high levels of competitiveness and an adjustment to standards that can lead to structural reforms. It is recognized that a globalized world needs open and flexible markets. In the first decade of the 21st century, Italy, Spain, as well as France, were characterized by a rigid labor market that wouldn't permit them to be internationally competitive. This is why we can predict that some reforms aimed at a greater flexibilization would have been implemented in any case. A second scenario could be the one that follows the Keynesian theory of economic cycles, according to which after a boom there is always a bust. Thus, we can predict that a crisis, sooner or later, will have happened and affect the three countries we took into consideration. In this context, the structural fragility that affected the Italian and Spanish labor market at the beginning of the 21st century would have been object of a correction towards a greater flexibilization. In conclusion, the economic crisis of 2008 and the implicit conditionality of the European Union have just accelerated the process of modification and adjustment of the labor market and welfare. What do you think would have happened?